Hi, and welcome to the first session of Logical Time and the Production of the Intelligible by Hare. In Jean Cavaillès on Logic and Theory of Science, publishes posthumously in 1947, two central theses emerge. One, science operates outside of time as understood through the lived experience of consciousness. Two, non-simultaneity is not historical, but an intrinsic feature of the intelligible. These ideas form the foundation of a theory of logical time, whereas mathematics is characterized by its unique historicity. Its relationship between early and later theories, themes by Cavaillès based on Descartes' treatise and mathematical concatenation. This seminar explores how this theory, focusing on mathematical history and its philosophical stakes, illuminates the broader tradition of the 20th century French mathematical philosophy. Rarely studied in English, this tradition, represented by the figures like Léon Brunschvicg, Albert Lautman, and others, emphasize the history of mathematical production and its shared conceptual terrain with philosophy. Using LTS as guide and drawing from the sources, the seminar will construct this broader intellectual history in two parts. Part one examines Cavaillès' place within a tradition grappling with the production of the intelligible, rooted in Brunschvicg, Cartesian rationalism, and the paradox of producing time within time itself. Cavaillès reframed the classical problem by asserting that the intelligible is defined by internal non-simultaneity and a rejection of total simultaneity in knowledge. His methodological insight that self-evidence has been replaced by probability interprets intuition as a production of concatenation and by what Richard Descartes called a change of operation, aligning with the 19th century mathematical transformations. Part two will consider how these transformations set the stage for a particular research program in historiography of mathematics. We will take Cavaillès to have implicit advance a speculative interpretation in which conjectural results from the mathematical logic of the 1920s and the 1930s concerning the so-called limitation of formalism, Gödel, Sokol, Church-Turing, were taken to be positive discoveries concerning the nature of the intelligible, the intrinsic movement and resistance in principle to combinational enumeration. What is at stake here is nothing less than a metaphysics of mathematics production derived, its claim, from an epistemological research program for reading the actual history of mathematics. In other words, the core mathematical considerata in the tradition of treating each mathematical work as a regional and specific product, Desanti, 1983, for all that is often presented as a strictly methodological or epistemological norm, in fact has roots in underlying metaphysic distinctions between production and what is produced, or in Cavaillès' language, between the effectuating and the effectuate. As Cavaillès understood it, this means that contemporary mathematical logic had shown that ruin of any philosophical of transcendental constitution, and thus of a post-Kantian approaches to the philosophy of science, including phenomenology. Against such philosophies of the transcendental subject, Cavaillès paradoxically proposed a theory of the act without a subject. We shall close by considering the origins and future of this doctrine in philosophy of mathematics broadly conceived. Our instruction, Hare, is a doctoral research at the Center for Modern European Philosophy, Kingston University, London, working on a PhD entitled The Effects of Concatenation. Jean Cavaillès' mathematical philosophy, his research focuses on epistemology and history of modern mathematics, especially in France, the historiography of philosophy and the tradition of rationalist philosophy, both early, modern, and contemporary. Matt, the floor is yours.
Thank you. It's funny to hear this description as the beginning, because I wrote this in, I can't remember now, November or December when I was proposing the course. So things have changed a little bit since then, mostly because I completed my PhD. My Viva is actually next week. So that bio will be out of date very quickly. My time with the CRMEP is coming to an end. And I have rethought one or two things in the process of the last 4 months of writing, but broadly that is kind of a decent outline of the way that we will approach the material. So this session, I'm going to do a bit of a presentation, which I'm not necessarily going to do every time, because I think we can be a bit more participative as we go along. But I realized, looking over what I prepared this morning, that I characteristically did not really introduce Jean Cavaillès, which we'll do more substantially in the other weeks. But just for people that have never encountered this figure, though I presume if you're signed up for the course, you have some interest. Cavaillès is a kind of mythical figure within French philosophy of the 20th century. I mean mythical in the sense that he's perhaps more celebrated as a figure and as an important part in a number of polemics in the French philosophical field than he's actually read. What I mean by this is that his main philosophical posterity, if you like, rests on the essay that we will in some sense orientate this course around, on logic and the theory of science, which is not Cavaillés's title for the work. It is produced in first the prison at Montpellier, and then the prisoner internment camp at Saint-Paul-en-Joux in the winter of 1942, when Cavaillès is imprisoned for his role in the French resistance. Essentially, Cavaillès breaks out of prison with this manuscript and proceeds throughout the beginning of 1943 to attempt to revise it, and also to write a technical introduction that would explain to an extent some of the mathematical and logical content, which is presumed throughout the more philosophical exposition in the essay. In the event, Cavaillès is arrested and eventually executed by the Nazi occupying forces, and most of his documentation and papers are lost, including whatever draft did or didn't exist of this introduction and the most up-to-date version of the essay that we receive. So what happens is that after the war, his collaborators, Georges Canguilhem and Charles Elsman, I'll give more of these detail and names in other sessions. I'm just setting the scene. They compile a version that he had sent as a typoscript to his friend, Madame Foulquier, and publish it bearing the title Sur la logique et la théorie de la science, on logic and the theory of science, which is not his. It's intended as a purely descriptive title. It's certainly the case that logic and theory of science are important terms in the essay. And the manuscript as it exists closes with this polemic in which Cavaillès states that the progress of science is, quote, between material or between singular essences, its motor the demand that each of them must be surpassed. It is not a philosophy of consciousness, but a philosophy of the concept that can yield a doctrine of science. The generative necessity is not that of an activity, but of a dialectic. And we'll return to these lines as a positive theoretical formulation quite a bit later in the seminar. But effectively, after the war, the generation of the more celebrated, let's say, French 1960s structuralist milieu figures such as Derrida, Althusser, and Foucault, in different ways will adopt this polemic split of the philosophical field. That's to say, the opposition of a philosophy of the concept to a philosophy of consciousness, and use this in a whole variety of different ways, kind of nourished by this figure of Cavaillès, as Canguilhem called him, as a resistant by logic, or according to logic. So this idea of the mathematician philosopher, resistant until death, with a hand grenade in one pocket and a mathematical notebook in the other, as Canguilhem also puts it, becomes extremely important for the post-war generation, but I think broadly disconnected from a reading of Cavaillés's actual work. So in the long history of his, well, he's not so long, he dies in his early 40s, but in the history of Cavaillés's work, he basically did a decade of research of epistemology of mathematics from the late 1920s to the late 1930s, writing histories respectively of set theory and of the Hilbert program, or modern mathematical proof theory. And then he has this 178-page essay with which we'll be concerned, which in a certain sense, which we again shall have to consider, is a theorization of the philosophical stakes of the practice of the history of mathematics that he had carried out in his doctoral studies. But insofar as this work circulates, it's really for its programmatic statements, the content of which are not so clear, disconnected from a real reading of his history of mathematics texts, which I think people don't read for the basic reason that they are history of mathematics texts, and they're primarily concerned with formalism. And then further in the English language context, Cavaillès has barely been translated. There was a bad translation of this book in the 1970s, which hasn't really circulated. And finally, Knox Peden and Robin McKay have produced a much more viable contemporary translation in 2021. So that's revived some interest in this essay, but none of the rest of Cavaillés's theoretical writings, with the exception of his PhD defense with Albert Lautman, also translated by Robin, exist in English. So it's a difficult object to teach this person's work, not least because the work itself, even insofar as if you have access to the French, is pretty obscure in certain senses. I mean, obscure is the wrong word, but opaque maybe, insofar as it doesn't tell you any of the technical problems to which it responds, nor does it clearly distinguish as an essay between when it's an exposition of the various figures with which Cavaillès deals, and its, let's say, positive doctrinal stances. So that's the kind of problem of the text. And now I'm going to say a little bit about how we're going to approach the seminar, but we're not going to say so much more about Cavaillès today. I'll just say this, which is that, hang on, let me pull up the presentation. Can you see that okay?
Yes, yes.
Okay. So, basically, I would like us to approach this seminar by reading this surviving text on logic and the theory of science as what I'm going to call a theory of logical or mathematical time, in a sense that we'll get into in later sessions, structured around the following theses. So, to quote exactly, first, that science moves outside of time, if by time we mean reference to the lived experience of a consciousness. And second, that the fact that everything cannot be at once, d'un seul coup, we'll talk later about why this is a Cartesian figure, has nothing to do with history, but is the characteristic of the intelligible. And the approach I would like to take in this seminar is not to do a simple linear reading of the text, but to use the existing text as a clue through which to construct what I'm going to call this tradition and also a problem, which is the tradition of different theories of thinking the idea of logical time, which we could also paraphrase in a certain sense as the problem of time without temporality, and this associated problem of how to think the production of the intelligible. And immediately this formulation, it poses all kinds of interesting problems. If science moves outside of time, what can be the medium of this movement? Is it even intelligible to speak of a time which is outside of temporal experience? And broadly, I'm going to devote the first half of this seminar not to so much focusing on Cavaillés's text, though we will read parts, but to kind of outlining what I see as the history of this problem and why Cavaillés's text intervenes with respect to it. And then in the second half of the seminar, we're going to deal more directly with the actual construction of the text, which I think will be more legible in light of the historical material we'll have covered in the first half of the seminar. And throughout, I want to try to understand how the problem of mathematical time, as Cavaillés conceives it, emerges out of this basically a historiographical research program, in the sense someone like Lakatos would speak of it, in what this French tradition would have called mathematical philosophy. So stemming out of his professor Léon Brunschvicg, who we'll discuss. The formulation philosophie mathématique, mathematical philosophy, was conceived by these authors as being opposed, in a certain sense, to the idea of philosophy des mathématiques, philosophy of mathematics, insofar as the idea is a kind of immanence of philosophy to mathematics and not an external philosophical discourse on mathematics. And we're going to be concerned with the kind of, I'm uncertain if the term metaphysics or ontology is better, and we could talk about what's meant by metaphysics here, but let's use it as a placeholder. The metaphysics that underlie this way of reading the history of mathematics. And so we'll always try to relate problems in historiography, by which I mean just methodological questions concerning how to read the history of mathematics, to these broader philosophical and metaphysical questions, because I think that one of the special interests of Cavaillés's work, and also the tradition from which he emerges, is the way in which it ties metaphysical speculation to a very concrete practice, in a sense, as a historian of contemporary mathematics, which is another category which I would like to discuss as we go forward. So only from next week will we start with Cavaillés's text. And this session, I'm going to do something quite different, and I hope that this is enlightening. It's a bit of a gamble to start this way, which is to start from some more contemporary concerns in the philosophy of mathematics, because I think it's always useful to start thinking from, where we're at these days, and then work back to why I think Cavaillés is useful. So the concepts I'd like to focus on for this session are what I'm going to call the trans-theoretical character of the mathematical object, and the form of historicity, or what I'll call production, that is proper to mathematical theories. And so we're going to focus on two texts, as I said, not by Cavaillés, and I think these were circulated already, ? Did anyone have, I don't know if people had a chance to read them or not. Were these sent around?
Yeah, everyone should have received it.
Yeah. Okay, good. So the first is David Rabouin's A Philosophical Task in Our Time, a very recent text from 2023. And the second is Jean Toussaint de Santi's A Path in Philosophy, which is a kind of somewhat retrospective text. So the structure, as we'll follow it, is we'll discuss basically what I want to draw out of each of these essays in turn, and we'll have a bit of a break in the middle. So are there any questions or discussion before we go into talking about the first text, or do we want to go straight into the first text and then do discussion? I don't know what's a better way to proceed here. It's a little weird because I have the PowerPoint up, so I can't actually see if anyone's raising their hand or anything. But Frida, you can tell me if should we go straight ahead?
Let's read and then we discuss.
Okay. So the first text that I set is this task essay by Rabouin, a philosophical task in our times, and it is very interesting, in my opinion, very interesting sort of programmatic text. Let me pull out my copy of it. Really begins from problems in the historiography of mathematics and historiography of science as they're posed today. So Rabouin adopts the title from Ian Hacking in one of his various papers on styles in scientific reasoning. And I think Hacking is an interesting figure we can maybe discuss just informally at different points in this seminar if we get to it. But as Rabouin lays it out, Hacking highlights that there are effectively what seem to be two incompatible orientations concerning the history of scientific knowledge. In the sense that there are two incompatible, meaning in contemporary writings or in contemporary ways of writing about science. So on the one hand, we find what could be called micro-historical studies, which focus on the specificity of different local knowledges, and in a category we'll have to discuss practices. So that's to say they focus on a kind of narrow reconstruction of precisely in what way different scientists worked, either sociologically or in terms of textual history, and they don't assume a common regime of comparability of concepts in the history of science. And disciplinarily, this corresponds in a certain sense to what gets called science studies, or STS, after, let's say broadly, the 1960s in the Anglophone world, but also Foucauldian approaches, and in mathematics, which we'll discuss in a little moment, in what gets called the philosophy of mathematical practice. And this is a kind of broad set of research which is historicist and pragmatist in its orientation. And on the other hand, we have what Rabouin calls a cumulative view, which is to focus on global conceptual structures and try to understand how there are invariants in the meaning of concepts across different contexts of use. So here, great importance is placed on the objectivity of knowledge. And this objectivity is understood in some sense to be time independent. And in a historical sense, this corresponds to, let's say, longue durée type histories of knowledge. It's why Hacking calls it Brodelian. But also in the way that Rabouin's beginning to play with this, it corresponds in a large sense to the way that a lot of analytic philosophical approaches conventionally have treated science. So as Rabouin states, the problem posed by this conjuncture is that we have these two approaches to knowledge, both of which appear to be correct, but we have no theory of knowledge that can accommodate them. And so the task in our times of the title of the essay is to elaborate such a theory of knowledge. And taking mathematics as our example, I think that the general problematic here is something like what it's called the problem of the trans-theoretical character of the mathematical object. So the elaboration of this theory of science seems to require what Hacking and Rabwan following Hacking calls a metaphysics. Here there are references to the mid-century analytic tradition of metaphysics, such as Quine and Putnam. That's to say, a return to very general philosophical consideration of the nature of the object of science or of mathematics. And this has a kind of brute opposition between what Rabwan calls the pole of the stability of reference and of the variability of contexts. Or that's to say, in other terms, the pole of the sameness of objects across contexts versus the pole of the instability of reference. And what is meant by this, it's that basically, it's clear that scientific practices change, but in order to understand how it is that they change and develop, we have to also be able to say something, however minimal, about the fact that they bear on a common object across time. So if you say, I don't know, just the most general kind of statement, the way in which we conceive space is different in the 20th century versus the 18th century, the notion of space has to have some kind of commonality in order to explain the sense in which scientists from the 20th century meaningfully transform theories about some object or another, which was the same object, in a sense to be specified, sorry to be very fuzzy, in the earlier period. So this is the first sense of what's meant by the trans-theoretical character of scientific objects. And in the case of mathematics, this problem, I think, is, or Rabwan is pointing this out, but I think he does so correctly. It's especially acute because we cannot, as mid-century analytic philosophy of language, again, referring to people like Quine and Putnam, or more perhaps Kripke is the paradigm case here, we can't resolve this opposition between the sameness of and variability of the concept by an external account of reference. So the way in which, again, I'm simplifying a great deal here, but the way in which a lot of these mid-century approaches tried to deal with this question was by saying, well, okay, there's something empirical which we point to when we speak about the measurement of space, which is a kind of extra, not extra scientific, but it's something which is external to any particular scientific practice, and which is the common of these different practices. So you're using this kind of way to measure space, you're using that kind of way to measure space. There's still something which is the activity of measuring space, which can be ostended to as the common ground of these different practices. But it seems that in mathematics, we cannot point to, again, to use this notion, a common object and say, there is the thing which, I don't know, Euclidean and non-Euclidean geometries respectively refer to when they say the plane. Because the object is only constituted by these practices. So the problem becomes, how is it that we can, internal to mathematics, account for the trans-theoretical character of its objects? And can we indeed posit something like a global meta-theory for the individuation of objects, a kind of unified formalism that would say, okay, that's what a number is, that's what a shape is, that's what a theory is, that's what an axiom is. And then from the standpoint of this global meta-theory, allow us to situate every different particular mathematical theory as referring to a common set of objects. And I think that the very diversity of historical mathematical practice militates against this. It's not formally clear why the way in which you do arithmetic in the period of the Greeks and the way in which you do it in contemporary mathematical logic has to refer to the same set of objects. Further, it's clear that mathematics often deals with informal practices, which are only then later formalized in the kind of way you receive them in a textbook, like a set of axioms or so forth. So it won't solve our problem of how to speak about the trans-theoretical character of the object in history, just to try to do it from this like abstract meta-theoretical standpoint. And I think that the primary examples, some of which we've already begun to talk about here, which Rabwan is thinking about in the essay, of examples, that is, of what let's call context variation, are when you have reformalizations of particular notions, which are in some sense the same across history. So they're diachronic examples. So obvious ones we might think of here would be the transition from an early Greek conception of number in Euclid, where numbers are basically measures, and thus always have a positive magnitude, to a modern conception, which includes something like 0 and negative numbers. Super simple textbook kind of example. So from the Greek conception of measurable numbers, something like 0 or the negative numbers don't even belong to the same kind of class of object, because a number is just the name for a measurement of a magnitude. So in what sense are both of these concepts of number in scare quote? Another one we already just mentioned, the transition from Euclidean to non-Euclidean geometry. So what is the kind of conception of space, which is common between these different periods? One which I think we'll return to is the problem of function. So this is a bit more complicated, and I'll do a bit of a kind of exposition on the concept of function in, I think it's session 3. But if you're working in the 18th century, what you assume to be a function is going to be what now would be called an analytic and continuous function. That's to say, it's the kind of thing you did in high school, presumably. You have f of x equals whatever, and it'll look like a kind of continuous line, which is drawn on an xy Cartesian grid, and which is given by an analytical equation. That's what the concept of function means in the 18th century. Then, through a long history of the 19th century and all kinds of problems of formalization, we come to now the conception of a function in general as any arbitrary correspondence. So it can cover discontinuities, things like infinite sine wave series or Fourier series that condense around points where there's no longer any continuous measure. But it can also even cover, like, you can speak of a function that goes from all of the people in this class to their favorite fruit or something like this. So it assigns that, like, I can't see the names right now because I've got the slide up, but one I can see, Sebastian likes apples. That's a function that assigns the people to fruit, whatever. This kind of conception of a function, completely alien to the kind of functions being dealt with in 18th century mathematical analysis, but develops directly out of the general discourse on the idea of function over the course of, say, 150 years. So, again, what is the same such that we can intelligibly speak of these very different formal concepts as bearing on the same notion? And then in just a last meta-theoretical kind of idea, the very notion of what a proof is very different from the period of, say, Descartes, where it simply means a reasoning which is convincing in various senses, evident, intuitive, to something which is itself a formal concept in the body of mathematical logic and proof theory. But as Rabwan points out, and I think this is a beautiful example in the text, it can also be let's say, a synchronic problem, which is to say that mathematicians who agree at the same time, work at the same time, can also disagree on the content of mathematical concepts. So actually related to what I was just talking about with functions, Rabwan details, he discusses this example at the beginning of the essay, like around page 143, 144. He discusses this anecdote of a debate between the mathematicians Claude Chevalier and Oscar Zariski, where they're having a debate about something to do with curves, and they can't get clear on each other's views. And Chevalier asks Zariski, okay, so what do you call a curve? And Zariski goes up to the blackboard and draws this line, this continuous line. Says, well, that's a curve. That's the object which we're trying to formalize when we have different theories of curve. And on the other hand, Chevalier draws an equation, f xy equals 0, of which the geometrical curve is simply a representation of this equation. But the notion of a curve could include algebraic formulations that don't have a neat, blackboard drawable type representation like this. So on some level, these mathematicians both understand that they're having a debate about the concept of a curve, but on Zariski's view, we're talking about something which is basically representation first, let's say, and which equations try to capture. And in Chevalier's view, it's a particular mathematical formalism that we'll call a curve, which could be representable or not. Nevertheless, they fully understand each other to be speaking about a common object, in order indeed for them to understand themselves as disagreeing about this object. So what Rabwan writes about this case is, he says, what is obviously troubling in these exchanges is that the actors sometimes seem to disagree not only on major epistemic values that could always be claimed to be external to their practice, but on the very characterization of the objects and the methods of reaching them. This problem is particularly important because it gives us a synchronic view of a phenomenon that unfolds diachronically as the very fact of the history of science. So it's slightly weirdly formulated, but what I understand Rabwan to be saying here is these kind of canonically referenced cases, which I did on a couple of slides ago, like the transition from earlier concepts of number to a modern concept that includes negative number or Euclidean to non-Euclidean geometry or whatever, which represent what might be called in Kuhnian language paradigm shifts in mathematics, in fact only highlight a problem which is internal to any kind of mathematical reasoning, which is that mathematicians share objects that are not necessarily given in a common formalism. So any account of the individuation of the mathematical object can't start from a formal theory. So yeah, I kind of just said this, but that means that the trans-theoretical character of the object is found even internal to a given time. And continuing to cite the essay by Rabwan, he writes, the ubiquity of the mechanism of conceptual variability, which can be located on very small time scale and sometimes in a single individual, that's to say that's what's highlighted here. So of course, over the course of a mathematician's life, they may reformulate something fundamentally, but they still, in some sense, reformulate the same thing. That's what's meant by the problem internal to an individual. So there is therefore no need for several actors. The very fact of, quote unquote, better understanding an object, and that this better understanding leads us to revise our own judgments, and thus the possibility to deny essential properties, is enough to open the question, how then do we relate to the same object? I think I've repeated myself a bit here, but hopefully this kind of question, which will concern us in many ways throughout the seminar, is a bit clear. And so Rabwan concludes this little argument. To hold that each conception produces its own objects would be to support a regime of generalized misunderstanding, including with ourselves. So if it's just that the way in which you formalize a mathematical theorem produces its object completely discontinuously from the informal conception, then even internal to one person's work, they wouldn't be able to understand how they have reformalized something. And Cavaillès, Rabwan here is, I think, implicitly, I mean, not implicitly, this is a quote he makes, but he doesn't go into so much of the history here. He's in kind of sympathetic polemic with what has emerged today as the so-called paradigm of the philosophy of mathematical practice. And I'm not going to give the whole history of this because it would take us a long way aside from our aims in the seminar. But broadly, within the English language discourse on the philosophy of mathematics, the first half of the 20th century, all the way up until, I mean, in a certain sense, the 1990s, but let's say at least until the 1960s, was highly dominated by the mainstream of analytical philosophical approach. So names you may or may not be familiar with, like Bertrand Russell, Frege, and then Quine, which made the question of philosophy of mathematics turn on basically the problem of formalizing the foundation of mathematics, and often on very technical debates in set theory and mathematical logic. And what emerges progressively from the 60s and in an accelerating way in the 21st century, which is when the term philosophy of mathematical practice arises, is the attempt to take a more historical approach to mathematics and to return to what is often polemically called an analysis of mathematics as it is actually done. Sorry, the bells are ringing outside. I just have to. So this paradigm of the philosophy of mathematical practice and its focus on the actual description of the actual work of mathematicians originally emerges, in a sense, most prominently around several key works on Greek mathematics and on the Euclidean diagram. So one is Raviel Netz's The Shaping of Deduction in Greek Mathematics, and the other is a widely circulated paper by Ken Manders called The Euclidean Diagram, both of which return to Greek mathematics and try to treat it from the standpoint of, okay, what were these mathematicians really doing? How did they work? What are the informal assumptions behind something like Euclid's Elements? In order to consider from a different philosophical standpoint the status of the mathematical work that is found in those texts. So the sort of methodological citation from the beginning of Netz's book, which Rabwan cites here, is the following. What unites a scientific community need not be a set of beliefs. Shared beliefs are much less common than shared practices. This will tend to be the case in general because shared beliefs require shared practices, but not vice versa. And this must be the case in cultural settings, such as the Greek one, where polemic is the rule and consensus is the exception. Whatever is an object of belief, whatever is verbalizable, will become visible to the practitioners. What you believe, you will sooner or later discuss, and what you discuss, especially in a cultural setting similar to the Greek, you will sooner or later debate. But the real undebated, and in a sense undebatable aspect of any scientific enterprise is its non-verbal practices. So, just in a word, Netz's point is, in some sense, the historical period of Greek or Euclidean mathematics is defined by a common space of practices, ways of doing mathematics, what he's calling non-verbal practices, how you measure, how you write a proof, how you demonstrate something, what is convincing and what isn't, within which the space of possible disagreement between practitioners is then shaped. And implicitly, this is taken to be the case actually for any period of mathematical work. And so, as in another sort of discipline shaping text, which Rabwan doesn't cite, Paolo Mancuso's textbook, with many authors with essays in here, The Philosophy of Mathematical Practice, 2008, Mancuso writes in the introduction, the contributions presented in this book are thus joined by the shared belief that attention to mathematical practice is a necessary condition for a renewal of the philosophy of mathematics. We are not simply proposing new topics for investigation, but are also making the claim that these topics cannot effectively be addressed without extending the range of mathematical practice one needs to look at when engaged in this kind of philosophical work. Certain philosophical problems become salient only when the appropriate area of mathematics is taken into consideration. So, again, in polemical context, this kind of argument is, it won't do, like, if all you're interested in is foundations, then you can just read set theory, mathematical logic, Russell, Frege, and to a certain extent, settle within that technical debate. And nothing within that debate will ever get you to consider the question, what is a mathematician doing when they use a diagram? On the other hand, if you examine 19th century work in the beginning, in the sort of genesis of topology, you will immediately have to consider what is at stake in a diagram and its formalization into a set theoretical version. So it's only if you look at the practices of mathematicians that you're going to get a kind of broader problem set than if you just approach the question of mathematics from its logical, the side of the question of its logical formalization. So this is the kind of polemic that philosophy of mathematical practice is engaged in. And so the field in which Rabwan's paper is intervening, which I don't know if it would be so clear if you weren't in these debates, is to say, okay, let's say we agree that this kind of focus on this practical turn is appropriate. And in fact, simply in a certain sense, brings into mathematics a perspective that was already present in the study of many other disciplines in this kind of what I call micro-historical or Foucauldian, whatever approach to history, but which had not really been imported into Anglophone study of mathematics. You still need an account of what an object is, or indeed what a practice is, which requires returning to first order philosophical investigation. You cannot be simply satisfied, this is the point that I think Rabwan is making, with a kind of pragmatist assumption that you know what it is to observe work as it is actually done. You need a criteria for individuation for the objects with which you're dealing. And that's why metaphysical questions don't go away just because you've announced a return to practice. So in a sense, the methodological debate for this field of mathematical practice, which Rabwan is putting his finger on, is this question I have at the top here. Do we need a general account of what a practice is? So a key figure in the discipline like Kenneth Manders will say no. So I'm quoting from an address he gave here, like a lecture, called How Do Mathematical Examples Contribute to Intelligibility? For the French Philosophy of Mathematics workshop in 2020. I've got the references at the end and it's online. And he writes, or says, that we sometimes need to speak of epistemically distinct communities, say Euclidean versus Cartesian geometers, is a necessary embarrassment. In philosophical tradition, it tends to raise demarcation questions. I recommend not getting hung up on them at the current stage as unproductive. No practice demarcation theory could shed better light on this or help telling the two apart. A broader lesson from this case. If you want to make an epistemic point of potential broad philosophical interest that might require notions not yet worked up in philosophy, you better be working on a clear case. Cut to the chase. Philosophical interest is acquired in the making of the point, not by theorizing abstractly about practices. Community standard agency talk serves at the current stage. This is a very confusing, folksy way that Manders speaks. So community standard agency talk, he means within the people that say they're doing philosophy of within people who say they're doing philosophy of mathematical practice, they'll speak about agents. This agent had this kind of reasoning. And everyone kind of accepts that you can just talk that kind of way without having a theory about it. So in that sense, he writes, community standard agency talk serves at the current stage because it is flexible and richly extendable by promoting everyday experience talk to theoretical term as needed. If we find something interesting, someone may later come along with a new restricted discourse like logic in which it may be more rigorously considered. My recommendation is methodological, not dogma for ultimate philosophy. So against this kind of argument that we don't need an account of quote unquote what a practice is to do philosophy of mathematical practice, Rabwan thinks we do actually need such an account. So he says this kind of strategy, and he's referring to the Nets quote I used, but I think Manders it would be the same, is at the heart of the program of a philosophy of mathematical practice and reproduces within a certain delay a quote-unquote practical term, which had already imposed itself for the same reasons in the study of the experimental sciences. But it should be noted that from a philosophical point of view, this solution will be of little value if it is not able to specify how one can delimit a practice. If the analysis of the practice leads to saying that Rutherford and Bohr, or to use the example which I used before, Chevalier and Zariski do not share the same practice, the problem of knowing how they could relate to the same objects will remain unresolved. If, on the other hand, we hold that they share the same practice, the problem will arise of knowing where the boundaries of such a practice pass if it encompasses incompatible views. And in a footnote, Rabwan talks about the example of Leibniz and Newton. So you don't want, on the one hand, you need to be able to you don't want to end up in a situation of saying that mathematicians that exist at the same period share fundamentally different practices to the extent that we can no longer explain how it is they can even disagree about the same object. So the problem of the object has to be, in some sense, trans-theoretical and transcendental with respect to any particular practice in order to explain how people can share the same object while disagreeing about it. On the other hand, you don't want an account of a practice which is simply indexing a vague historical period of work, such that we cannot explain how anyone could ever disagree if they, quote unquote, shared a practice. So the example of Leibniz and Newton, both of whom developed accounts of the differential calculus around the same time, famously, and disagreed with a vituperative debate in the field of that moment. We can't end up saying that they simply shared a practice and that determined their work to such a way that the way in which they disagreed becomes unintelligible. So we need to hold these poles open. We need to be able to account for how it is that people can share an object while disagreeing about the object. And that means that the notion of practice as an analytical term becomes quite tricky. We need an account of how it's different from simply a formalism, from simply sharing the same time and so forth, if it's going to do work for us as historians. That's the kind of conjuncture I think that Rabwan is intervening into here. So he proposes that the problem of the contemporary philosophy of mathematics, in a sense, concerns different, what he calls modes of referential stabilization, which is he tries to draw out of Leibniz, and we're not going to get into that in this seminar, but because the way in which the mathematical practice paradigm tends to think of a practice is as basically a particular mode of inference. It's a way of reasoning. So in some sense, Euclidean geometers, even if they don't all agree on every single part of their work, share a way of thinking about mathematical objects understood as a kind of set of inferential patterns, a common language about what counts as a good or even an acceptable argument, which of course is something that changes historically. And that the practice term people think is kind of sufficient to individuate a way of working. But Rabwan closes or nearly closes the essay by saying, confining objects to their inferential role only makes the problem of trans-theoretical identity all the more acute. I.e., the fact that certain objects, say the Euclidean circle, can be reinterpreted in other inferential practices, starting in the Euclidean case with Archimedes, but just as well with Cartesian, algebraic geometry, complex analysis, or modern algebraic topology. If the identity of objects is limited to their inferential role in a given practice, such phenomena of reinterpretation will simply not make sense. And finally, we should note that the stabilization by the material practice of the various symbolic systems which Manders highlights will be of no help in cases where these systems are different, typically in the case of different notational systems. So I think we've kind of covered this kind of argument, but the kind of way that someone like Manders thinks about work in the Euclidean diagram, his object is precisely Greek mathematicians who are using this form of diagrammatic reasoning, and that kind of material anchor is sufficient to talk about them sharing a practice. But that will not give you any help in understanding how it is that, in some sense, the same object is taken up in its reformalization in Cartesian terms, because the entire quote-unquote material or notational system has changed. So these are the sort of very broad theoretical issues which Rabwan's essay is picking up on, and which I think define, actually, in ways we'll get into, some of the contemporary stakes of the corner of philosophy of mathematics I'm interested in, and which I think something like Cavaillés's work could make an intervention into, as we'll discuss basically for the rest of the 7 weeks of this seminar. I wanted to give this a kind of taste of the contemporaneity of the problem. So I hope this is somewhat clear as an exposition of the essay, but I'm going to stop sharing for a second. So maybe before we take a break and do the second thing that we'll discuss, we can just any questions, or if anyone has something else that they got out of the essay, we'll talk for I don't know. We have until, for me, it's 4:08 now. So we go till 5:30, right? So
Yes.
let's discuss now until 4:30. And then we'll take a little break, and then I'll discuss the Desanti, and we'll discuss that one. So yeah, I'm open. I mean.
Yeah, well, thank you for all of it. That was absolutely rich But yeah, just I wanted to maybe try to contrast it with whatever I already know, since I am new to such a subject. So definitely influenced by Goethel's set theory. I don't know how can this be related to maybe Bachtin's chronotope. Um, and I guess that's about it for me.
Sorry, you said Gödel's set theory.
Yeah, and how essentially um, the limit per se of mathematics, or in this ontological space, so which is can be seen as a practical applied ontology, where if you are to start axiomatically, some axioms will eventually produce non-provable axioms, which is, I think, the move to computation rather than just uh, applied mathematics. So automated mathematics, Turing policing.
Now, I'm going to put aside the question of computation and effective computability and all of this for now, because in fact, we'll hopefully deal with that at some length at different points later in the seminar. But I think Gödel's epistemological position is interesting here, because he basically is maybe the most famous contemporary, as in, let's say, post 1930s case of a real Platonist in mathematics, to the extent that in the literature sometimes the hardest version of Platonism is called Gödelian Platonism. But what he means by this, as I understand it, is that because of the incompleteness theorems, so because no single axiom system can adequately formalize the mathematical object, we actually have to say that the mathematical object is in some sense transcendent with respect to any particular way of thinking about it. And that means that in a kind of quasi-Platonist sense, we can, and he uses this language, intuit the reality of the object. So something like the continuum. Like we can have an idea of the continuum, even though we can prove that no single formalization of the notion of the continuum will adequately give it in a single formal system. So he, in a way, takes the incompleteness results, which are in other perspectives read as a kind of proof of the limitation of our reasoning, as on the contrary, a proof that in reason we can grasp something which is absolutely transcendent with respect to any particular formalism. So that's the kind of Gödelian Platonist position, and I think we'll come back to these kind of considerations about Platonism more than once in the seminar. But I mean, they're a little external. They're not external. Rabwan is really speaking as a historian here, so it's just how are we even going to understand what count of the object do we need to even understand how it is that mathematicians at different times can speak about the same object? It's a very practical question in a certain sense as a philosopher of mathematics. But these more, metaphysical questions, like the Gödelian Platonist standpoint gets you into, are, and I think Rabban would agree, unavoidably lurking in the background of these methodological debates, even if, let's say, the more sober or pragmatist historians of mathematics would like to think that you can avoid them. That seems to be something of his argument.
Yeah, absolutely. If I could just extend that a little bit, regarding the historicity of conceptual objectivism per se, I can't help but contrast it with Bachtin's chronotope and the polyphony of whether be it present or withdrawn interlocutors taken the same moment in time. So I don't know if that's the right way to describe it as.
Yeah, I'm only in the most passing sense familiar with Bakhtin, so I'm not going to comment on how it relates to his theory. But the problem of course, thinking of the mathematical object as the kind of ideal pole of possible intersubjective relations to the object, is another way of thinking about these things, which we'll discuss maybe more through the Husserlian or phenomenological version of that. I think it was Zhao. I don't know if I pronounced that right. Next.
It's João, but it's okay.
Joao. Okay.
What I would like to ask you is that in Rabun's text, when he's discussing Foucault, this micro-historical approach to these problems, he puts Bachelard on the time list, and I had a little bit difficulty trying to understand in what sense Bachelard is someone who would play into that approach, because in my mind, he does something like Leibniz in the sense that he thinks about like a coherent pluralism. It's how he describes the problem of the emergence of physics and chemistry, right? So I just wanted to understand, because I feel that is something that is important for the argument that I am missing. So thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think probably what Rabwan would agree with, but in any case, it's my view, so I'll just say that this is the case, is that all of the figures in the French tradition of quote-unquote historical epistemology, which would include Bachelard, Canguilhem, and then in the mathematical side, Cavaillès, Lautman, and their students like Desanti, are in a kind of neither nor position, or maybe a both position with respect to this microhistorical versus cumulative. So Rabwan is in a bit more in that line, but these figures are totally absent from the interlocutors that Rabwan is addressing here. So Rabwan knows these figures, but basically no one reads them if you do philosophy of mathematics in English. So the practice turn, as it has imposed itself, is a post-pragmatist. Often Wittgenstein is the major theoretical referent, or it's like real historicist, like Skinnerian type arguments, or as a major interlocutor, Lakatos, Kuhn, and so forth. Not any of the French figures. But with respect to Bachelard in particular, it's been a little bit of time since I read any of his more concrete studies, like in Le Rationalisme Appliqué or Applied Rationalism, as it's called in English, that book, or The New Scientific Spirit. But, he's definitely a case study person. So within the time of the 1930s, Bachelard would have appeared to be on the side of an argument, which then I think it does develop into like stuff like hacking or Foucauldian approaches, which would say you can't understand what science is by just having an a priori theory of science. So against something like neo-Kantianism and its development in a certain contested sense. I mean, it's contested to call it neo-Kantianism, but into like Carnap analytic philosophy. There is an ideal that you could have a first philosophy that says, okay, something like what is a syntactical theory? And then that will be valid for any scientific theory that you want to plug in. Like that's the form of a theory, Whereas in the French tradition, the way of working was to say, okay, you want to understand what chemistry is, like look at how the very first chemical analysts were able to separate a particular substance, more or less. Look at how they actually did it. And that the philosophy is in how they actually did it. That's what tells us what it is to think, not the a priori theory, which in fact is not an a priori theory, but an a posteriori kind of, in a way, a freezing of a particular movement of science. So all of these French figures also belong to what we could call a kind of, I'm going to say mobilism. I'll use that category a bit later, but Bachelard's own term is mobile rationalism. So you want to think the movement of science in its capacity to produce ideas and not fix it by any particular like trans-historical conception of what a theory is. And that's what would seem to make them friendly to this more pragmatist microhistorical orientation, even if the metaphysics behind it is actually quite different, I think, than the pragmatists. I don't know if that makes sense to you. Well, Bachelor.
Yeah. I was just, because I just read like this book on what kind of rationalist Leibniz was, and they quoted a passage from the Theodicy in which Leibniz writes that the lack of necessity in the laws of nature is something that attests to the beauty of God, or something like that. And I thought there was, more or less in the way like a coherent pluralism or something like that, which is something Bachelard works with. But yeah, I understand what you're saying. Thank you.
We'll maybe get into Leibniz next week a bit. But anyway, let's leave that aside for now. Yeah, Kemal.
Hi, Matt. Yeah, my question is about like how actually like the direction actually I am really heading towards as well. So as far as I read Cavaillès, it's as you mentioned, it's his kind of, he actually mentions the philosophy of concept in his book, and this is, I think, related to the like where to ground knowledge, whether it's on the subject or it's on the object. But I think he's more towards the movement, the movement of the mathematical practice itself. And it's kind of, there's like an uncertainty of the direction where it really heads to, like its unpredictability of the movement and things like that. So I was wondering, in relation to all these, that we will have in the future, where the referential stabilization plays a role. Like, does it have a central role in relation to the philosophy of concept in Cavalier?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that, the spoilers, but like what Cavaillès will call a concept is, in a certain sense, I mean, it's complicated, but it's the way in which one concept turns into another concept. So that sounds a bit circular, but I mean, like, what is the concept of function? It's, in a certain sense, this thing which is visible only in the logic of the before and the after, which moves you from the way we think of a function in the 18th century to the set theoretical concept of a function in general. The concept of function is not any of those particular formalizations. It is the motion that is particular to all of those reformalizations. And a large part of Cavaillés's theoretical enterprise in the doctoral studies, so it's prior to writing On Logic and the Theory of Science, and so I'm aware that unless you read French, those are not accessible texts. But a large part of his interest is trying to understand how you can account for this kind of what he calls double unity of a theory. And we'll discuss that. I think I need to look back at the syllabus, but I think it's actually the week after next, or next. Yeah, the one where we read the introduction and conclusion to his doctoral study, which I'll provide my translation of. But yeah, in a certain sense, he tries to give an account in the earlier works of what he calls the central intuition. That's his term, l'intuition centrale, unifying a theory. So, in some sense, there's a common gesture, that's another term he uses, which different mathematical theories constellate around in sharing, like an object. I don't know. I pick this up and I pick this up, and that gives me the idea of one thing and then another thing, and I can think the ordinal numbers by putting them for 1 and then 2 and then 3 left and right, or I can imagine another gesture, which is that I see them all at once and I count them as a set, and I have an intuition of what cardinal as opposed to ordinal counting is, and that these kind of primitive pre-theoretical gestures are like something like material practices around which different theories constellate. And I think that's the view throughout the doctoral studies. And then in a way, the weirdness of On Logic and the Theory of Science is that he proposes this idea of a philosophy of the concept, which jettisons this notion of intuition and instead tries to say when you individuate a mathematical theory, you do it as its historical chain of reformalizations, as the movement of the concept, which in a way replaces the earlier theory of gesture or of intuition or all of this kind of more naturalistic way of talking about things. So that's part of the transition that we're going to have to understand in the seminar.
Okay, thank you.
Do we have any other things for now? Okay, well, I think then we'll take 5 minutes because the Desanti essay is quite dense as well. And we'll have to go into some other territory. And I want time to discuss and then get a bit more of a general discussion going at the end. So let's say we come back in, how long is a normal break for this? To be 5 or is 10 more realistic?
5 is more normal. Yeah, it's
Okay,
standard.
fine. Then I see you at 4:30 my time.
Okay. See you.
Okay. Is everyone back? I mean, clearly not everyone, but I mean, I don't know actually. I think I'm just gonna start straight off because I have quite a lot to say about this Desanti essay, which is in a way, the Rabouin essay served to give some taste of the contemporaneity of these problems, but we're now going to work our way back towards Cavaillès. So Desanti, as he relates in this biographical piece, which I said to read, it was one of Cavaillés's kind of star students and is one of the people after the war who, with his major work, Les Idéalités Mathématiques, not translated, the mathematical idealities of 1968, kind of is one of the few people, I think, to produce sort of systematic work in the Cavaillesian tradition. And so he gives a kind of account here of his formation and some of the problems specific to it, which helps us get back, I think, to a sort of setting of the scene for understanding the specificity of the Cavaillesian project. So without further ado, let's have a little talk about what I want to extract for us from this essay. So yeah, as I said, this essay gives a kind of topos of French philosophy with which we'll be concerned, and I want to point out three things which I think are important for us. So first, Desanti very well lays out here a kind of particular conjuncture in rationalist philosophy in France circa the 1930s, and a historical background in a certain reading of the history of philosophy, which we'll return to. Second, he poses the problem of quote-unquote Platonism with respect to the mathematical object in a way that I think will be useful for us. And third, the kind of categories of ideality and the production of theories, which he considers towards the end of the essay, very well summarize, I think, something close to Cavaillès in the sense that it's one way one could read the Cavaillesian program a bit more systematically, given how minimal the formulation of that program is on logic and the theory of science. So we'll work through these. And then, yeah, so Desanti lays out in the beginning of this essay that essentially his own formation, so this is circa about 1936 to be precise, was really formed by these two teachers who in fact succeed one another as the so-called caïman of at the École Normale Supérieure, which is the person who's responsible for coaching the students for their agrégation, which is the major exam that gives you access to doctoral studies in that system. So Cavaillès was stopped in 36, and Merleau-Ponty took over his position. And in a way, these figures represent, on the one hand, the project for historical epistemology of contemporary mathematics. That's to say, both a history of mathematics, but one that tries to relate that history to what's happening right at that moment, to kind of give a genesis of the contemporary in mathematical work, which is orientated around fine-grained study of mathematics as it is actually done, to use the terminology of the practice people, but also on the sort of conceptual history and genesis of specific theories. So this will be Cavaillès, but in a way, going all the way back, their teacher, Brunschvicg, who was the teacher of Cavaillès, and his collaborator, Albert Lautman, and so on. And on the other hand, the project of transcendental phenomenology, which is understood in Desanti's terms, which probably is a bit different from, let's say, the other post-war Heideggerian understanding of phenomenology. So in this sense of transcendental phenomenology, it's understood as the formal analysis of the modalities of object constitution in their relativity to different theoretical domains. So this is Husserl's phenomenology, of which the major representative work is probably, for this generation, Formal and Transcendental Logic of 1928. So maybe not the Husserl that is most familiar to people. And in which there's a kind of implicit analogy between theories and consciousnesses. That's to say, one can, in a certain sense, speak of the object constitution horizon internal to a theoretical domain, in the same way as one might speak of a consciousness having its objects. This is the kind of phenomenology at stake for Desanti. So he speaks about having learned these two languages, as he puts it, in the French context of the 1930s. And on the other hand, this conjuncture in which these two theories arise and for him fight each other in a certain sense, was informed by this very particular quote unquote rationalist history of philosophy, in which the major synthetic figure of importance was Cavaillés's dissertation supervisor, Léon Brunschvicg, who's, in my opinion, a crucial figure in 20th century philosophy, very much underrated figure. Sadly, there's almost nothing in English. There's a good book by Pietro Terzi, which I'll put in the resources at some point when I update the Google Drive, or maybe I'll put actually better Terzi's shorter article from the recent Oxford Handbook of French Philosophy. But he was kind of the key figure of French neo-Kantianism, and he outlines this particular history of philosophy, which Desanti again narrates here, which is basically a sort of progressive history of the quote-unquote creative intelligence or intellect. That's to say, it's the kind of history of the production of the rational through the canon of rationalist philosophers. So Plato, Descartes, Spinoza, Kant, it's always the same references with Brunschvicg. But in this history, methodologically speaking, mathematics plays a privileged role in the progressive emergence of reason. So the major argument of Brunschvicg's really defining work for this tradition, Les étapes de la philosophie mathématique. I don't like this translation, so it's usually translated as the stages of mathematical philosophy. It's a book in 1912, but the literal translation would be the steps of mathematical philosophy. And I much prefer the term steps, because I don't think it's I don't know, the word stage implies something much more settled to me, but it doesn't really matter. It's just not it's not how I would speak about the book. Also, you have a different word for that in French, l'étage. Anyway, the steps or the stages of mathematical philosophy is this kind of progressive history of mathematics, in which the history of philosophy is read as downwind of the history of the development of mathematics. So as Desanti, in fact, nicely summarizes in his preface to the republication of this book. So there's this preface, the book's from 1912. It's re-edited in French in 1973 for the first time in a generation. And Desanti writes the preface. So it'd be before the text that we read. Desanti uses this to kind of summarize the tradition of mathematical philosophy. And he says, my translation, Brunschvicg belonged to the species of philosopher readers, born of the division of labor, and he's just talked about between philosophy and science, or philosophy and mathematics. So in this conjuncture of the early 20th century, it's the first period in which it's sort of no longer disciplinarily possible to be a working mathematician or working scientist and a publishing philosopher, which is historically quite new. In fact, yeah, Bachelard he mentions as kind of one of the rare exceptions to this case because of his experience in the laboratory. But putting that aside, there's this historical division of labor now between philosophy and science, which gives rise to this idea of the philosopher reader, the philosopher who reads science and who, resuming the quote, searching through the works of mathematics that had already been produced and we could thus say consigned to writing, he, that is Brunschvicg, had to locate those traces capable of indicating the paths traveled by their productive reasons. And so on this conception, the expression mathematical philosophy, which is Brunschvig's signal term of the work, again, as opposed to philosophy des mathématiques, philosophy of mathematics, mathematical philosophy thus takes on an original meaning. It's not a question, in the name of philosophy, of implementing a speculative approach in order to complete what the mathematician had already begun. It can only be an illusory undertaking to try and speak some truth concerning number, space, or movement that the mathematician caught up in their game of techniques could only glimpse. It is moreover equally illusory to claim to define ex cathedra the status of first principles, and thus wish to isolate the proper object of mathematical philosophy. Mathematical philosophy can rather only be made manifest in the constitutive movement of mathematical works themselves. So, in context, Desanti's text here, he's also just in the process of writing his second kind of major book. So following his study Les Idéalités Mathématiques, he produces this. Hang on 1 second. I think my son is awake. I need to just 1 second. Sorry, teaching on a Saturday for me is a bit complicated. I have the office from next week. But anyway, yeah, where was I? He's with his mother, by the way. I didn't just lock him out. Mathematical philosophy can rather only be... Oh, yeah, sorry. Desanti has just also written, is in the process of writing what will become his second book, La philosophie silencieuse, the silent philosophy, which is his sort of critique of other approaches to the philosophy of science in that period. And it's clear that, in a way, his critique here is sort of every major approach to the philosophy of science. So, be it Husserl or Hegel or Russell, all of these figures for Desanti have the problem that they attempt to define from the standpoint of philosophy some truth of, for example, the nature of number, of space, of movement, or what a concept is, which concrete mathematics then only provides examples of, often insufficiently. So in the case of something, he has an extended analysis of Hegel's work on the infinitesimal calculus in this essay, in this book, The Silent Philosophy, in which he says, well, the Hegelian discourse will end up with the position that you say, whatever's going on in the analysis of the 18th century is the wrong way to think of the infinite, as opposed to the real way to think of the infinite, which is in the dialectic of the concept. So his polemic is that philosophy cannot do in this Hegelian or Husserlian or all these other ways he details, cannot take the self-sufficiency of philosophical discourse and constitute itself as governing for the movement of mathematics. It has to think from the side of mathematics. And just polemically, he's writing in 73 this context to the reedition of Brunschvicg's 1912 essay. This kind of slogan, which he attributes to Brunschvicg, mathematical philosophy can rather only be made manifest in the constitutive movement of mathematical works themselves. That's him, in a way, creating a tradition that I think is there in Brunschvicg's work, is certainly there in Cavaillés's work, and in Desanti's own, but which is, Brunschvicg is not so maybe polemical about. He equally writes on Plato, he equally writes on he edited the works of Pascal, he's a historian of philosophy. So Desanti's doing some polemic here, but I think it's very relevant for the kind of essay we're reading by Desanti to understand that's the kind of move he's trying to make. And so one last quote from this introduction I translated. So that is to say, mathematical philosophy, consists in isolating within them. Sorry, I missed the square bracket here. So within the mathematical works themselves. That's just a clarification because the quote continues. It's directly, this is the sentence after the one on the previous slide. So I restart. It consists in isolating within them. Mathematical philosophy consists in isolating within the mathematical works themselves those operations of the intelligence that have instituted the norms appropriate to their objects. For this reason, the philosopher who conceives such a project must take themselves to the school of mathematics, learn its language, and enter into its content. In the same movement, the reflective moments and culminating points in which an unbreakable link between mathesis and philosophy is woven are to be designated and unified, traversing the materials provided by empirical history. The slow emergence of the forms of mathematical intelligibility thus provides the frame through which the history of philosophy is going to be interpreted. The French is grille de lecture. So remember that he's talking about the philosopher reader of mathematics, and in French pedagogy, you have this notion of a grille de lecture, like the reading grid, the way in which you're going to break down a text. So he's using that metaphor, for the philosopher reader of mathematics. The emergence of mathematical intelligibility provides the framework through which, in fact, the history of philosophy itself will be interpreted, and not vice versa, wherein philosophy would have a kind of primacy over mathematical reflection. So that's one sort of setting of the scene. That's a tradition that we're going to be concerned with. Second point from Desanti's essay is the way he talks about Platonism. So he, I think, shows very well how all of the figures which we're going to be concerned with in this seminar occupy a tense position with respect to so-called mathematical Platonism. So the French interwar context, that's between World War I and World War II, is profoundly steeped in a Platonic, or moreover Neoplatonic discourse. And the very notion that we're going to discuss of the production or creation of the intelligible should be understood in these terms. The intelligible is the realm of the ideas, not a register of experience or understanding. It's not to do with intelligibility, But on the other hand, all of these figures, even I think Lautman, who's the closest to a Platonist, he's explicitly a Platonist in his own terms, but all of them oppose so-called mathematical Platonism in the sense in which we will find it in analytic philosophical literature, where it refers to a position of the affirmation of the trans-historical reality of the mathematical object, conceived as something static and mind-independent, which can be, in a sense, adequately grasped through intuition or through formalization. But the point being, it's about the existence of the object. And none of these figures are Platonists in that sense, but I think none of them would think that that's what Plato thought either, in ways that we'll have an occasion to get into later in the seminar. So, heuristically speaking, the problem for this tradition of mathematical philosophy is about the generation of mathematical objects and not about their reality, in scare quotes. It concerns this kind of question as to I've got a typo on the slide here, the form of the relation or movement between abstractor, I should say, that's the typo, other typo, and not the purported existence of mind-independent abstract entities. So it's not about whether there is like a thing out there called a circle that we intuit, but about the relationship between different mathematical objects and how to think the specificity of that relation or movement, which for them has, a root in the Platonic corpus. So it's in these terms that one has to take a stance on the fact that, as we'll discuss in a moment with Desanti, mathematical objects, as found in real mathematical texts, are in some sense in time, but not the time of conscious experience. But this is always in dialogue with a sort of Platonic set of categories, even if one refuses Platonism. And the whole terms of this debate are quite external to what you'll find if you search online, like mathematical Platonism. And so I think Desanti is very good on this. In this essay, he writes, so the beginning of this quote is him citing Plotinus from Aeneid 6:6. It is the object itself, the intelligible object. That's number, by the way, the it, I believe. It is the object itself, the intelligible object, because it is without matter. That is at once intelligibility and thought. It is not a thought in the way its definition or the representation we may have of it would be, but being in the intelligence, it is itself nothing but intelligence and science. And now Desanti. So this is what I call a serious Platonist. If there are truly real numbers, then they are contemporary with intelligence and with the intelligible. In that case, one cannot speak of them without describing the structure of this intelligible world, and without showing the way in which these numbers behave there and the function they perform. However, to retain of Platonism nothing but the realism of mathematical forms, and to avoid the problem of the structure of the world of forms, this, it seemed to me, could be nothing but an ad hoc hypothesis, serving only to reassure the mathematician as to the degree of consistency of his objects. Desanti uses just male pronouns throughout this text, and I'm just going to use the quotes that way, but I don't love it. Anyway, that's the way the text is written. So the consistency of his objects, the mathematician. Where was I? Yes. So here we see, I think, very clearly that the stakes of being a quote-unquote serious Platonist involve actually something much broader for this tradition than simply the kind of reflexive Platonism of the mathematician, which is what I think one finds reflected in the category of mathematical Platonism, which is just to say, clearly the object, in scare quotes, is something eternal that can be intuited. It's outside of any of time or whatever. If you want to be a serious Platonist in philosophy, you have to say number tells us something about the structure of the intelligible world, which means you have to believe that there is such a thing as the intelligible world and a structure of the forms, even if that form's structure is a kind of motion or a becoming. You can't just limit yourself to saying something about the specific certainty of the mathematical object. And this is in the actual text why Desanti takes distance from quote unquote serious Platonism. So he writes, this kind of ontological primacy of the mathematical entity over the series of acts, making it available as an object, has always been a mystery to me. And one mystery for another, I prefer those inherent in history and in time. The logical categories themselves, however transtemporal they may appear, must, it seems to me, be understood as essentially tied to the life of that historical being doomed to die without recourse, which is man himself, Homo sapiens. It remains that what is called true achieves existence only inasmuch as it is thought, said, and proved, in other words, only in time. But with respect to this quote, I think the elocution true here must have a meaning beyond merely empirical confirmation. So Desanti, even in his refusal of quote-unquote Platonism, wants to affirm the objectivity of the mathematical concept. So the problem is, the central problem for Desanti's philosophy, how is it that the objectivity of the concept can be produced in time without recourse to the quote-unquote Platonic hypothesis of its absolutely independent transtemporal existence? And this, I think, is a good way of showing how what we discussed with Lautman, that's to say the trans-theoretical character of the mathematical object, returns to a kind of central role within the posing of the problem of Platonism for this tradition. And Desanti's own solution, which he presents as genetically Husserlian in this text, and also which he says he thinks was in a sense insufficient, but which is the one in his work, Les Idéalités Mathématiques, that predominates, is to speak of the ideality of the theoretical object. And in a sense, this is a strategy, which we'll see is common to Cavaillés's work, of identifying truth with the logic of objective historical constitution. So in a certain manner, we in fact refuse Platonism, in scare quotes. Once more, we'll get back to what this means, but we refuse Platonism by identifying truth with time, but in the sense of this time which is not just the time of the experience of the individual consciousness, the time without temporality that we're going to try to understand in this seminar. And this whole discourse is itself articulated in terms of the Platonic notion. I think of the movement of the intelligence, or the movement of the intellect, which is a more Neoplatonic than a properly Platonic concept in a certain sense. So that's kind of a major part of what I'm calling this topos that we're going to understand throughout the rest of the seminar. And then, and this is my third and final section on the Desanti essay, I want to talk about these terms ideality and production that he brings forth towards the close of the essay. So as just mentioned, Desanti uses this idea of ideality as a kind of modified Husserlian position on the what we could call the objectivity of the object. So as he states, by object, I then, that's to say in the book Les Idéalités Mathématiques, meant the unity of an ideal pole held invariant, and on the other hand, of an open field, which is not necessarily unvarying, an open field, not necessarily unvarying, of procedures providing access to its domain of properties. So what is at stake for Desanti is a kind of theory of the object as that we define the object as that which is invariant within a specific field of variation. And for Desanti, this is drawn from a kind of Husserlian language, but it's a version of what Cavaillés himself calls the duality between the act or the operation and the object, and which Desanti glosses here as the pair field of procedures ideal pole. That's to say, the ideally posited kind of pole of unity around which these different theoretical procedures constellate. So this is a phrasing of the trans-theoretical character of the object in, let's say, post-phenomenological terms. And so what I think you could say that Desanti and Cavaillès and other in these traditions share, all in a contested manner, with Husserlian phenomenology, is the attempt to take what we could call a middle position or a mediate position, reality of the mathematical object. So they all want to say, even, I think, again, I'll mention a few times, but Albert Lautman, who's the most Platonist in this tradition, they would all say that the mathematical object is not an in itself existing absolutely and transhistorically as an object, so against Platonism in the sense of mathematical Platonism, but nor is it only the interior intending on the part of the mathematician or a community of mathematicians of a particular mental representation or psychological state or so on. So they're neither Platonists nor what would be called in the conjuncture psychologists. Not in the sense of the discipline of psychology, but in the sense of psychologism. And so this is precisely, in fact, this neither nor, to neither be a Platonist nor a psychologist, is the theoretical problem that Husserlian phenomenology also sets out to take up. And I think Desanti is very good in this essay in highlighting something about the shared concern between Husserlian phenomenology and parts of the French epistemological conjunction. And finally, we kind of get to the next step, which is to say that these idealities, these objective structures of object constitution and so forth, the whole schema just described, are nevertheless still produced in history. So that's to say that there are different structures of ideality, of objectivity, and that in a certain sense, the history itself possesses an objectivity, which is the objectivity of this production. And that the only access we have to this is that they're given to us. I mean, qua historians of mathematics, the only access we have to these idealities is in the real corpus of mathematical texts. So here we actually prescribe a certain method. And this method defines epistemology as Desanti, in his taking up of the language of Brunschvicg and Cavaillès, understands the term. So the role of epistemology is to grasp what he calls the act that produces the object, but to do so only from the side of an analysis of its concrete realization in actual mathematical works. And these works must be read as products of what produced them. So these kind of set of quotes are the last thing I'll discuss. Desanti writes, laying out the kind of task of epistemology in this tradition. If we admit that a mathematical theory is a quote-unquote product, that is to say that it is introduced within a tradition-bound cultural domain, such as a series of written texts whose meaning one needs to grasp, and the procedural indications contained within which one needs to reactivate, then the following question cannot be avoided. In what way, by what acts of constitution, and in response to what motivations, in what already available theoretical field, and following what intended ideal objects, was the meaning we have to reactivate deposited there where it is offered to us, that is, in the mathematical text. To raise this question is to try to reconstruct, and this is a very important point, through a study of the product, which we have to decipher, that's to say through the text, the organization of the acts that have formed it. An organization which at the outset is hypothetical. The question will always arise as to how to grasp both the status of quote-unquote ideal objects and the modalities of the acts that led to them. So given this, the object as it appears to us in a text, we have to understand something of the act that produced it. From the ideal pole, we have to understand something of the field of procedures that give that pole, make that pole legible. And so as he continues to lay out this kind of program, Desanti says, so it remains here that the reference to positive historiography is doubtless always necessary. And then I shorten the quote, but he says, in context, he's talking about, but it's not simply doing history of mathematics. So we're trying to understand why epistemology is not simply history of mathematics. The task of epistemology, understood the way in which it is practiced in Les Idéalités Mathématiques, does not consist in substituting an ideal history for the raw materials of empirical historiography. That is, in substituting a linked chain of concepts, of ideas that follow one another, as one says, reconstructed on the basis of the present state of mathematics, a sort of philosophy of history of mathematics, reconstituting the stages of a development that is posited as progressive. So I just want to point out, because this essay is written by Desanti for an English language publication of contemporary French philosophers in the 80s, but it's written by him in French and translated by, I'm not sure who the translator is, let me look. Kathleen McLaughlin. So I don't know what the original French says here, because it's never been published in French as far as I'm aware. But I think we can assume that when he says here that the task of epistemology, as he's trying to lay it out, does not consist in substituting empirical historiography by a ideal history of what is called here a linked chain of concepts. I'm just going to assume, because also it is the definition that he gives, ideas that follow one another, that the term in French was enchaînement, concatenation, as Cavaillès, well, I mean, like as I translate Cavaillés's use of enchaînement, and that the term stages here is almost certainly going to be a translation of étape, so in the sense of Brunschvicg's les étapes. So it's not, he's distancing himself a bit from the Brunschvicgian tradition in saying that epistemology has to deal with the real historical text and not let it disappear into this purely ideal concatenation of the rational stages of thought. And hang on, yeah, so two parts of this quote. So he continues directly. I just put that as this is the next sentence from the previous quote. Rather, so on Desanti's view, that is epistemology, is a matter, and herein lies the whole difficulty, of grasping in a regional and specific product, that is to say, in such and such a theory, in such and such a state, in such and such a series of texts, the ways of access to the constitution of the meaning of the ideal objects which are to be recognized therein, and which there remain deposited just as the sense or meaning of an inscription is deposited in the marble. This means that an epistemology such as this requires, at least initially, that he who speaks, in this instance the epistemologist, place himself with no presupposition other than being able to realize and to reactivate the procedures in the intra-theoretical complex with which he is dealing. So in order to understand the mathematical object as a quote-unquote regional and specific product, we need to try to reactivate the modes of production, which are the condition for the intelligibility of that product. And in order to do that, we have to basically, in a way, speak the language of the text. We have to inhabit the whole, quote unquote, consciousness, which allows that object to exist in a historical period. And that's why you have to actually do history of maths and so forth, which is a bit of a different task from simple history. It's a kind of, it's very Husserlian, what Desanti is saying here, in his sense. It's a kind of internal phenomenology of mathematical history. And so, last part, this means that the epistemologist's problem is how to work from the inside and to redo what is presented as already done, to strive to elicit in this operation the theoretical fields, the positing of explicit objects, the implicit references, and here the reference to historiography is necessary, to which the actual progress of the living mathematical thinking, which is at work in the only thing available to us, namely the product, was a response. It remains that this living mathematical thinking, whatever it is that we attribute to Archimedes, Riemann, or Cantor, cannot be said to exist or to have existed, except in as much as it continues to address itself to someone capable of deciphering its products. And now here is the, way in which I think, we could hazard that Desanti's approach is more radically anti-Platonist even than Cavaillés's. So for Desanti, there is no absolute content to the concept. It's that the content of the concept is its possible reactivation by someone who is capable of deciphering it. So only insofar as a reader exists of the mathematical text does this living mathematical thinking of Archimedes or Riemann or Cantor exist. It doesn't have an external content. And this is a very, this is in a sense what is at stake in the term ideality. So it's an ideality is the objective content of a mathematical work insofar as it is reactivatable by the consciousness of a reader of that work. And I think that this strongly Husserlian kind of reading of the task of epistemology is one way of developing something like Cavaillés's project, but as we'll discuss, it's not the only one. But I think in any case, in terms of the conjunction between the Rabuan text, the problem of the trans-theoretical object, trans-theoretical nature of the object, Desanti's text is excellent for demonstrating something of the specificity of the French approach to these kind of questions and their distance from at least some of the norms of more pragmatist historiography in the contemporary English language sense. So that's kind of concludes the setting of the stage for what we'll pick up from. So I'm going to stop the exposition at this point. Here's the references, and I'll put the PowerPoint in the drive after each lecture, and let's discuss for a little bit. Yeah, Anand.
Thanks for a brilliant session, Matt. It was really intriguing. So I come from a literature background, like literature and philosophy, but and I'm doing a theology degree now. But my what I had to I had a couple of questions. That the word that Desanti uses, reactivation, in some other philosopher or mathematician's mind, isn't that doesn't that have a close analogy with the pseudosciences or the occult, where the occult it posits a concept called the egregor. Egregors are thought forms that one can access through similar mindsets, similar kinds of mental mental and cognitive abilities. So not only the occult through egregores, but doesn't it also advance a computational metaphor of the internet and how we log into the internet and reactivate, like if human beings are thought to be like analogous to terminals, and the internet is some eternal realm which we log into. So I was thinking of these two parallel discourses and metaphors, and how relevant they are in the philosophy of mathematics, or rather as in a more broad spectrum of comparatism, if applicable.
I mean, I think that we should head off from the beginning. Although there are people that have done, let's say, phenomenology, occult synthesis. It's not a unique move in the history of philosophy. The sense of reactivation is not the kind of, I'm going to be very brutal here, but like Jungian sense that there are things like archetypes that are brought back. It's really it's an account of what it is to have a common meaning between consciousnesses as interlocutors. So the idea is that, in some sense, consciousness, in the phenomenological sense, is always an intending of an object, even when that object is not a physical object. So if I look at the glass, the reality of the glass for a phenomenologist is all of the possible intendings that I can have of it, which can take the form of what's called like a subjective or objective transformation. So on the one hand, I could imagine that the object could be turned around like this while my cone of vision remains static. And each time you'll see these different adumbrations of the object. On the other sense, you could subjectively transform your gaze on the object. And the ideal pole of the object is all of the possible intendings of it. But how do we individuate something like that for a concept which is not an empirical object? So if you have that kind of account of what an object is, what is a theoretical object? And an appealing way of thinking about that through the notion of intersubjectivity is it's that the same people, so different people will be able to say the same thing about the theoretical object when reapproaching it, something like this. So we singularize something like the statement, the meaning of the statement 1 + 1 = 2, by the fact that the consciousness, when we read it on a page or whatever, will reactivate the same steps. It's very complicated stuff, and we can get into the epistemology of this, but that's the sense of reactivation involved. Now, this has a very profound overlap, which I'm just going to say we'll not talk about now because we'll run out of time, with the problem of computation, of the computational characterization of consciousness. And that will be something that we'll probably discuss further on. So I'm just going to say, like, yes, the question of computation, more than the question of the occult, but we'll put it aside for this second.
Thank you. Thank you.
Senza.
Hey, how's it going? How's the baby?
He's not a baby. He's a 4-year-old, but
Oh,
he's
he's a baby in his own universe.
Yeah.
Still,
No, so yeah, normally I'm going to have an office for doing this, but long story. But anyway, this time he's there. He's probably watching Transformers now, I guess.
no, yeah, that was a lovely moment. At least I saw it as well. How are you? You're doing well. I had a question based on something that you were mentioning previously. Let's say you were speaking about the intelligible not needing to do, doesn't necessarily having to do with intelligibility. You made some sort of distinction, if I grasp it correctly, on the realm of ideas from the realm of experience, particularly from these coordinates posited by Desanti, where philosophy, for example, is about the creation of mathematical objects, not necessarily the study of reality. I was just wondering if you could depth a little bit into this statement so that it be less limp, because it sounds sick as fuck, but I do think that it's a little bit limp. It's amazing.
Yeah, sure.
It sounds great, but I'm not sure if I'm getting it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit of a throwaway sentence on my part, but I'll try to unwrap it. I mean, the idea I had in mind is that, if you're a Platonist, you're talking in Platonic language about the creation of the intelligible. They also call the ideas the intelligibles in the French discourse. I mean, they'll often be translated that way. So you're talking about how it is that something like number or space is generated. And that's generated in the order of the movement of the forms or of the ideas. And we might not understand that. Our understanding of that might be extremely partial. In fact, if it's a Platonist, it certainly is. So when someone like Lautman will speak of the notions of the local and the global, which we'll use as an example at some point, the local and the global as an ideal or dialectical pairing will be partially manifested in all kinds of theories that try to make that notion intelligible. So you might localize that by speaking about spaces in Riemann or whatever, and see something of the local and the global. But the dialectical opposition of locality and globality is not reducible to any particular theory by which we make it intelligible. So when you speak of the production of the intelligible, you're speaking about what does it mean that the forms themselves are generated within the world of the forms, which is a movement or motion that we are attempting to understand when we do mathematics. It's not a question as such of the Kantian type question, what are the bounds of our finite understanding, and how does that shape the kind of objects that we can posit? So you assume, it's kind of a transcendental assumption, that there is some content to the concept which transcends merely empirical cognition. That's there in the very terminology of the intelligible or the ideas or something like this.
I get
Does
it.
it make sense?
It does. That drives me to my second question. Let's say, thinking it from that perspective, where we don't want to fall into this sort of loophole of Kantian self-referentialism, in the sense of ideas, forms, Neoplatonic forms, yada, yada, yada. I do see what you're saying. It's sort of like what Rabwin was mentioning about these programmatic approach to sort of understanding objects and meaning, right? That makes me think of a particular interest of mine, which is why I grabbed this seminar, which is the role in, for example, I think we're very much discussing the implications between mathematics and philosophy, in a sense, at least in the way we're discussing, we're taking this discussion initially. I'm interested in seeing the way in which mathematics finds a correlation or a point in common with other sort of more robust institutions or fields of knowledge throughout history. For example, religion. I do think that both of them are sort of metaphysical fields of reflection, which intermediate this notion of the quote unquote the intelligible discussed above, as we were positing in both religion and mathematics. But I will say that there is a difference in the role in which this discussion of defining the intelligible is important, since in a sense, in real terms, in actually existent terms, through history, religion has this quality that math does not have, despite using math for this purpose, which is being eutaxic, like holding itself institutionally through history, like politically, like eutaxia. I'm not sure how to translate that into English. I'm sorry. It's like this word in, I think it's Latin, like eutaxia, being eutaxic. Mathematics aren't eutaxic. I'm not sure.
Well,
based
yes
on the
and
question
no. I mean, this is the funny thing. Like, I'm going to put this as another one we put a pin in, because we'll get back. I'll try and say I'll think about something a bit later about religion, maybe. But I'll put at some point in the drive. I hadn't planned it as a reading, but there's a good essay by. Remind me if I don't do this. But there's an essay by Etienne Balibar on Badiou about the category of the history of truth. That's the term. And I can't remember, because there's that essay in English and then another one in French on Pascal, like what's in, because it's a Pascalian phrase, the history of truth, histoire de la vérité. But there is a sort of question about the relationship between mathematics and religion as disciplines in which truth has a history. The complicated thing in religion is that you have the category of the church. So in the church and the history of church dogma and debate around it is what is the medium of the historicity of this truth. So there you have the relationship in religion of orthodoxy and heresy. And I think it's maybe this that doesn't exist in mathematics as such. Or that's a complicated. That would be my first.
Some will argue that that's not the case. I mean, one could say that that exists in the history of mathematics, particularly if we talk about accountants, for example. The history of accounting, it's definitely the real paradigm on how the numbers develop. And I was talking in this way. The unit, the idea of one or two, or these Neoplatonic ideas of the ideas, like what Rabouin was mentioning of Plato wouldn't dare to call every single thing that we think has ideas. In that sense, I will say that that exists, that those regulatory institutions exist in mathematics. I mean, academia, computation, and accountants, I will say are the three top in that aspect. They do have political implications as well.
To be discussed. I take. Okay. I definitely take it. I mean, sorry, I want to ask, because we're getting close to the end. I'm happy to continue another 10 minutes because I talked a bit long. Other people, or do we have to cut it now because I need to do some housekeeping? But I want to answer a question or two.
I can go if everybody.
Okay,
can
so
stay,
we continue to set just till 17:40, and then so we take one or two more questions, and then I'll do some housekeeping at the end of the session about how we'll proceed here. Jacob, Kemal, you finished your question, or would you Jacob and then and then Kemal, and then
it's AA math. It's not really a question about like reflection, which maybe aligns with question that came up when it comes to Badiou, or for me it was really helpful while reading the text, or this reflection on this kind of middle position on the reality of mathematical objects
object.
that Husserl posted really rang a bell for me in regards to like this post metaphysical Platonism brought up by Badiou, in which he kind of moves beyond by embracing a fully formal subject independent ontology, which maybe kind of leans into that question that came up before, like this effort to.
I mean, I think Badiou is the most certainly the most accessible to English language readers inheritor of this tradition. And in fact, that's how I genealogically, I mean, a long way back, like I did my master's dissertation on Badiou in embarrassingly long time now, like 2013 to 15. And then I didn't really have French, and I got interested in the Cavaillès Lautman stuff, and then I had to learn French, and now it's a decade later, and this is where I'm at with it, you know. But Badiou's in the background to some extent.
Yeah.
I think in his own, and he definitely continues the kind of eulogy that Desanti has to this tradition in France, stemming from Brunschvicg. In his own narration, he puts himself a bit more Platonist than someone like Desanti, and associates himself within the field, and we'll discuss this split later down the line in the seminar, more on the Lautmanian than the Cavaillesian side of the discussion. So he considered, that is to say, Badiou considered Desanti, I think he says it explicitly somewhere, like the only person that developed or could have developed, I think he says, a systematic alternative to my philosophy. So he refers to Les Idéalités Mathématiques as like the book that's the most respected, like other of being an event or something like this. But in a way, I mean, it's a blunt heuristic, but you can imagine that there's a kind of Cavaillès-Lautman split around the question of Platonism, where the Cavaillesian one involves a more serious engagement with phenomenology and the problem of object constitution and so forth, and a bit of a de-emphasis on the transcendence of the mathematical object. And that a part of this is re-dialecticized through the Desanti Badiou discussions. I wonder if we should do some more discussion on this posterity, because I've kind of decided to go the other way a lot of the seminar. Like it's like how the problems of Cavaillès and Lautman emerged and not the posterity. But yeah, that's of course, it's a contemporaneity of this.
Yeah, sure. And I think like his identification of stat theory as like this science of being in a way is maybe also like an effort to put some more graspable forms as access to the world. I don't know.
Yeah, and I think that the Cavaillés's dissertational set theory would have been one of the major texts for this whole generation through which they read, including Badiou. I mean, let's just we do 2 minutes with Kemal, and then I'm going to do housekeeping for the.
All right, thanks.
Thanks.
Yeah, you actually talked about it a bit. So I think my question is, okay, with Lautman, we have the dialectic of concepts that you mentioned about the local and the global. I think with the mathematical Platonism, my understanding was that Lautman is really for kind of type of a Platonism that, let's say, there is something above the mathematics itself, which are the dialectics of concepts, say local and the global. Local and the global is not a notion of, say, of mathematics, but they are above mathematics. They are
opposing concepts in which, by doing mathematics, we incarnate those, kind of a relation between those opposing concepts. Kind of, you mentioned local and the global. Let's say the local expansion of a function, let's say the analyticity of a function, for instance, can be related to the topological properties of the surface itself, kind of. So in that sense, doing mathematics kind of incarnate those opposing concepts. Okay, so related to that, does Cavaillé actually oppose any type of external reference? Because my understanding was that Lautman is really referring something kind of external, but kind of external that you can only do it internally, kind of like, by in the practice itself. Can we really take it that way? And if so, where can we locate Cavaillé?
I'm really gonna say that this really gets into again spoilers. Like, it's something we will discuss, and it becomes one of the most interesting parts of Cavaillés's work, and we'll get there quite a bit later. But it's what I'm going to call his nominalism. So Lautman's interest, which has a big posterity in a lot of rationalist philosophy, in, for example, category theory and so forth, is the attempt to have something like a dynamic structural logic of the world of ideas and of mathematical production. That means that there are things like dialectical ideas, which are in some sense external to any of their particular manifestations in individual theories. And the question is, how can we have a sufficiently dynamic plane of comparison for this? The Cavaillesian question becomes quite different. It becomes that of trying to understand the form of historicity proper to mathematical work. And that involves, it seems, a refusal of the idea of a transhistorical plane of comparison for mathematical concepts, which actually then could seem to threaten a kind of skepticism. Like, every mathematical concept will be existing in a void and not speaking to any other concept, and then there would be the end of something like rationalism, insofar as that would assume the accumulation of knowledge. So a problem of the Cavaillesian enterprise will be how to think the form of reason itself in what he will call the superimposition of ideas. That's to say, reading past production through posterior production. So that's something we'll discuss a great deal as a logic later. So just the simplest possible, well, not so simple, but if you're working within 20th century concept of function, you will read something like the way in which the way in which Cauchy did integration very differently. That's like, you're not going to see, it's really the metaphor, those practices in the same way. But there's something specific in relation there. You see the older practice through the newer practice. And his reflection will be on how to think that. So in the quote with which I began, where he says mathematics is the progress between singular essences, that's what we'll try to understand by the idea of the singular essence, which will be a session we'll do on the Spinozist part of Cavaillés's work later. So this is in a way, it's about the Spinozist part of his work in relationship to the Platonism of this conjunction. But that's something for later in the seminar. Okay, because we're going to run out of time, I want to say a couple of things. We're already out of time. One is that I talked a lot this time, and I did this big presentation. I wanted to do that because it's my first time teaching with the center, and I don't know a lot of you. But I will, in the remaining 7 sessions, if people agree to this, I don't know how people feel, try to minimize that a little bit. So I'd like to be more discussion and really focus on the texts that we read. So, weighting wise, I'm going to do a little bit less lecturing, but I'll still do it. But how did this format feel? Like that do a PowerPoint on the texts? Would you rather that we just go straight into discussing the texts? Like, what is the feeling about this? Because I'm not sure what the... Yeah, it's my first time doing this. Sure.
So
Take it's Kemal and Emmanuel both.
yeah, I think yeah, from the syllabus, I understand that you literally will go through the Cavaillès book, which is actually pretty short book, I guess. I mean, I will be voting for something like, I mean, occasionally, obviously, I mean, if you do presentation and then maybe some close reading as well, maybe I think you mentioned that in the second part of the, so I will be in for presentations maybe in the first lectures, but then maybe a close reading with the of the text.
Yeah, I mean, that was sort of my notion, that effectively for the next 3 sessions, I'm going to present more to get the laying out of the material, because also those are the sessions that I envision, including both a little bit of an introduction to the mathematical context. In the session 3 will be that. So assuming people don't have access, I'll do a more like chunky like PowerPoint for this, just to talk about some of what's meant by the stakes of set theory, 19th century analysis, so forth, and also for the stuff that's not translated. So I'm going to give some more quotes and like French context on this. But then when we in the second part read the second 4 weeks, then I think maybe we'll do a little less presenting, but maybe we can improvise this as how it goes a bit. Okay, so it seems like this works for people for now. And we reassess like at week 5, how much we want to keep presenting or turn more to discussion. The second thing is to say for next week. So, and then we can stop. We have this Google Drive. I put the texts there. When you look at the texts, there's a note for each week with the texts. You'll see that it contains just the primary texts. There are the Descartes and the Leibniz, but the Descartes and the is a whole book, the rules for the direction of the mind. But I'm only asking you to read rules 3, 7, and 11. Which are in there along with their commentary. It's not so much of the Descartes really. The Saint Leibniz is very short, but what's not in that folder is the Cavaillès book. So what we're going to do next time is make a first reading of the first chapter of On Logic and the Theory of Science, and I suggest that you read through it. But it's this is a difficult essay. As I said, it doesn't have an introduction, so it begins like completely in situ with all of this really hardcore stuff on Kant. And I'm not actually going to talk about the Kant stuff next week in great detail, because I think it's going to be much more useful if we do that later. So my slightly nonlinear way to get into this is I'm going to focus on the section of the first essay, the first section of On Logical Theory of Science. It's about 25 pages. The last 7 pages, he deals with this figure Bolzano, and he says Bolzano rediscovers what he calls Descartes' difficulty concerning concatenation. And so next week, we're just going to talk about in what sense Cavaillès thinks that Bolzano's transformation of the post-Kantian problem of science reactivates this Cartesian difficulty. And that's how we'll sort of understand something about this problem of logical time that I want to study. So just in your own time, start reading the essay. If you don't understand things, it's fine. We'll probably have to read it multiple times. That's the way that book goes, and then supplement focusing on those 7 pages with the Cartesian stuff that I uploaded. I also put in the secondary text a nice introduction by Hacking, which is, I think, a very good text on why these Cartesian and Leibnizian problems reoccur in really contemporary mathematics. So he deals with sort of a computation and things like this. So that's a fun text to read if you want some background. But yeah, don't be intimidated. When I first read that Cavaillès book, if you haven't read it before, the happening. I had just no idea what it's like. You're just, I don't know what problem this text is even addressing. And so that's what we're going to try to do a bit of working our way into. I mean, I will put my strategy each week will be to put the presentation in the drive after I give the lecture. So every week, eventually by the end, you will have in session 1, session 2, session 3, all of the presentations, if that works for people. Yeah. Okay. Sorry, it overran a bit, and we'll keep it to time the other weeks and talk a bit more. Okay. Ciao.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Thank you.
You.